So this committee, as well as Ways and Means Committee, will be looking at revenues as well as looking at the budget items moving forward. We're going to focus today on the status of the state budget and the impact of COVID-19 on the state budget. I do want to point out to those of you who are watching this on YouTube, to the public, that we are very much appreciate the fact that our Speaker Adrienne Jones, has joined us. As you might recall, she's no a stranger to the Appropriations Committee, having served on that committee her entire status of her career in the legislature before becoming Speaker. But we welcome her and always welcome her support to the committee. Today we're going to begin with David Romans from our Department of Legislative Services, the Office of Policy Analysis, giving us an overview of the state budget. So recommended cuts to the Board of Public Works, the actions taken. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave.
Thank you. I think you have the presentation on your screen. We can go to the next slide, please. Yes, so what I'm going to try to do in this document is sort of walk you through where things stood at the end of session in terms of the state fiscal situation, and then how things have changed, and then finally kind of where we are and what kind of challenges ahead. So just as a reminder of where we were at the end of session, you had a fund balance for the current fiscal year of about $346 million. For fiscal 21, it was about $324 million. This is really one of the strongest end of session fund balances we've had in some time. And it takes into account both your budget actions as well as all of the legislation that was passed during the session. You also left a rainy day fund balance of $1.15 billion, which is 6% of general fund revenues. Now, you did authorize the governor to use $150 million of that money to help with the COVID response. And after session, he indicated he planned to do so. However, since then, we've gotten federal money that we can likely use in place of that. So we still probably have that 1.15 available to help with the general fund. The next slide, please. All right, so the impacts of COVID-19 are really threefold. The first is on the revenue side. The Board of Revenue Estimates was presented with a range last week of how much revenues would go down in fiscal 20 and in subsequent years. The range for fiscal 20 was essentially from about 900 million to 1.1 billion. So that's about 5% of the revenues we were expecting. For fiscal 21, the range was in the 2.1 to 2.6 billion dollar. And then it grows to about 2.5 to 3.9 billion for fiscal 22. So a very, very substantial challenge going forward. The Board of Revenue Estimates was guided by some economic forecasts that Moody's Analytics had done. They actually used the more pessimistic Moody's forecast because the Moody's baseline forecast had unemployment lower than what we are already experiencing, so it was too optimistic. It's worth noting that the Moody's assumption was that a vaccine would be widely available in the United States at the end of next summer, so not until summer, like August, September of 2021. Obviously, if the vaccine comes along sooner, the forecast would improve. So, there's also revenue impacts on other parts of our state budget. The casinos being closed is having an adverse impact, obviously, on the Education Trust Fund. If they stay closed for the rest of this fiscal year, about 165 million hole in the Education Trust Fund would have to be backfilled. Transportation Trust Fund, I think the subcommittee heard yesterday, kind of in the neighborhood of a 500 million revenue shortfall in both the current year and the upcoming year. And then the university system in Maryland has been talking about an over $200 million problem in the current year. So really every part of state government that's taking in money is seeing substantial reductions. There's going to be challenges throughout the state finances. The second impact of COVID-19, of course, is the health response and all the expenditures the state is incurring to respond. We know from the Department of Budget and Management that the state has entered into emergency contracts worth more than $300 million. In addition, the governor is committed to spending more than $100 million on small business assistance, and we have state workers getting paid at a higher rate to essential workers, a lot of state overtime in certain facilities. So a lot of additional costs. I think it's probably safe to say probably in the $500 million range in the current fiscal year at a minimum. And then the third impact that we've sort of identified is around the entitlement programs. We're starting to see entitlement caseloads grow, just as we've seen unemployment insurance caseloads skyrocket. And if we can go to the next slide, we show you the temporary cash assistance caseload trends. There's a little complicated here, but the line is the number of people enrolled each month from July 14 through April. And you can see for quite a long time we were declining in our temporary cash assistance caseload. But then in March we had a small spike, and in April we had more than 11,000 people added to the rolls. So over the last 2 months we've gone from roughly 40,000 people to 53,000 people. So the April enrollment was 30% higher than last April. So that's the most significant increase that I've seen in more than 20 years. So, very substantial and sudden growth there, and that's going to increase state costs. We can go to the next slide. We have a similar chart on Medicaid. All right, in this chart, what it's showing is the growth over the same month in the prior year. The bars are the number of recipients, how many more recipients there were than the prior year in the same month. And you can see we were already growing, partly because we continue to make efforts to make it easier to enroll in Medicaid, the health exchange, doing enrollment for Medicaid. But again, you can see in April, we had a pretty big spike in enrollment, and we would expect to see some of that continue. So quite a bit of pressure starting in our entitlement caseloads, which certainly in fiscal 21 will mean significantly higher costs as those are ongoing. We can go to the next slide. All right, so the good news, and you had a briefing on this before, so I won't get into this in much detail, is that we have gotten a lot of federal money, roughly $6 billion coming to the state and various institutions, hospitals, higher ed institutions, and so forth. And that $6 billion does not include the Paycheck Protection Program money, which is roughly $10 billion that's come to businesses in Maryland, nor does it include a lot of direct assistance to people, unemployment insurance benefits, and the $1,200 per taxpayer that the federal government is sending to folks. It also doesn't include kind of the enhanced SNAP benefits that are going out. As I told you previously, the problem with a lot of the money is that very little of it can be used to backfill revenue losses. It's mainly there to help cover the costs of the response, which is very helpful, but doesn't deal with our revenue hole. The one place where it does help us is in Medicaid, where we should get about $275 million from an enhanced federal match. The federal government's going to pay 56% of our Medicaid costs rather than 50% through June. And it's possible that will be extended. We can go to the next slide. This just shows you the detail on that $6 billion. We went through this before. I'll just talk about the first item once again, because it's the most significant. The Coronavirus Relief Fund is $2.3 billion. The federal government directly sent $700 million of that to our 5 largest jurisdictions, the city and the 4 biggest counties. The state had the rest of the money to allocate. The governor has agreed to send about $300 million of it to the other 19 counties. He's treating them the same as the feds treated the 5 big jurisdictions in terms of how the allocation was arrived at. And then it's about $1.3 billion then for the state to use. And we can use this pretty flexibly for any cost related to responding to the virus that are incurred through the end of the calendar year. So this certainly will help us with our emergency health response, small business assistance, paying our workers, more. The other piece of good news that's been received very recently is that they're trying to be a little more flexible on how we can use the money. So the US Treasury has indicated that the state can use the money for state police costs from March 1 on, and some other public safety and public health costs. So that will allow us to use these federal dollars in place of state funds that we had budgeted, and provide a little bit of budget savings in fiscal 20. I'm not going to talk further about this since I've been through it before, so we can go to the next slide. All right, so the rest of the presentation is really looking at the general fund and sort of the outlook going forward. So this first graphic, the blue bars show you the general fund cash outlook at the end of session. So fiscal 20 and fiscal 21, surplus is over 300 million. And then DLS was projecting a shortfall that grew over time by fiscal 25, well over $1.5 billion. And that included all the legislation that was passed. The gray bars show you the impact of the governor's vetoes on the budget outlook. So interestingly, fiscal 20, they had no impact. Fiscal 21, they actually put us in a weaker fiscal position because the veto took away the about 100 million of revenue from the tobacco tax increase that was passed, and it didn't reduce any spending in fiscal 21. So we actually end up 100 million worse in terms of our fund balance in 21. In 22 and 23, the vetoes have very modest benefit in terms of state finances. And then you can see there's a bigger gap in 24 and 25 where they do save us a lot of money. That primarily reflects that Kerwin costs were going to fall into the general fund in 24 and 25. However, what's not shown there, because we didn't score it, is one of the revenue bills you passed was to have a tax on digital advertising. And it's expected that's going to go to court and it's going to take some period of time for that to be settled, which is why we didn't score it. If that money ever actually materializes, it's estimated to be in the $250 million a year range, and it was going to go to help fund Kerwin. So it would have kind of mitigated some of the benefits of the governor's veto if we received that money. But certainly the vetoes do help in the out years in terms of reducing costs, but they do not have any sort of immediate benefit to the state. We can go to the next slide. All right, so this slide, we have those same two bars, just on a little bit different scale. And then we've layered in the two scenarios that the Board of Revenue Estimates presented, which they are very catchily called S2 and S4. We also layered into those S2 and S4 scenarios our estimates of the impact on entitlement programs of COVID-19. And you can see that the fund balance gets substantially worse. The S2 scenario is the red line, the S4 is the black line. Under either scenario, you're getting close to a $3 billion shortfall in fiscal 21. And then in fiscal 22, approaching or over 4 billion, and it stays very significant after that. So by fiscal 22, you're talking about 20% of the general fund revenues that were currently forecast would disappear under these two scenarios. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, so the governor has begun to respond to this to try to improve the fiscal outlook. The first actions that were taken were yesterday at the Board of Public Works, where 121 million of general fund reductions were made to the current year's budget. I'll go through the big items. The biggest item is 62 million. This is money that is in the dedicated purpose account currently, and in the BRFA last session, you all had directed it to the annuity bond fund to help pay debt service in fiscal 21. The governor's cutting that money, sending it to the general fund. The reason is that he believes that the bond premiums will come in higher than budgeted in fiscal 21, and they can support the annuity bond fund rather than the 62 million. The second big item is 35 million for WMATA. This is money that the state was supposed to pay WMATA, but was withholding pending the completion of an audit. We're told that the audit was not going to be completed until after the end of the fiscal year. So this money is being cut because it would not have been paid out. It's not 100% clear if this is just simply a deferral or if we will never be making this $35 million payment to Armada. Most of the rest of the reductions are to PAYGO capital activities and to some tax credit programs. The biggest being school safety grants was 10 million for PAYGO school safety in fiscal 20. Only 2.4 million had already been committed, so the other 7.6 million is being reduced. Then in the one of the tax credits, the historic revitalization tax credit had 9 million budgeted. Because there's a very large balance in the reserve account for this program, the governors are cutting this, saying we have enough cash flow to continue to meet our commitments. We don't need the money at the moment. And then you can see there's smaller reductions, mainly to PAYGO programs, including the Baltimore Regional Neighborhood Initiative, the Community College Facilities Renewal Program, and the Strategic Demolition Program. There is some funding left for all of those programs, but they are receiving less than was budgeted. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, so this is the final slide in our presentation. It looks at fiscal 20 through 22 on the general fund and kind of shows you the components of the problem and then some of the solutions. So it starts with where the closing balance was at the end of session. Shows you the impact of the vetoes in 21 and 22. Shows you the midpoint of the BRE's range of the revenue impact. So $1 billion revenue loss in 20 and grows by about $1 billion a year from there. And then shows the DLS estimates of the impact on entitlements. So in terms of budget savings, the two sort of known things are the BPW actions, as well as the enhanced federal Medicaid match. And then from there, we present some options of ways to balance fiscal 20 and sort of the levers will have to be looked at for fiscal 21 and 22. So, I mean, one obvious lever is the use of the rainy day fund balance. Now, we think that the state will be able to get through fiscal 20 without using the rainy day fund. One wild card I should mention in fiscal 20 is that because the final income tax collections were delayed from April 15 to July 15, we're assuming our estimates on those things are correct. Now, we're not going to know until July whether those revenues come in as forecast. So that's a certain risk that can make fiscal 20 a little bit worse. But assuming they're right, we don't think you'll need to dip into the rainy day fund balance. We think there's at least 100 million of savings that the administration can achieve through their hiring freeze, through reducing some operating costs that they're not incurring right now, and from using that coronavirus relief fund to pay for a lot of our police and some of our public health costs in fiscal 20 that had been budgeted with general funds. And then another option for the state is there's a substantial amount of bills, particularly in Medicaid, that come in after the close of the fiscal year, usually over $200 million. So we could just push those costs off, pay them in fiscal 21 with fiscal 21 dollars. It wouldn't impact the timing of when people get paid. It would just shift the cost from one fiscal year to another. It's really an accounting maneuver. So those things combined would get us out of fiscal 20 with a small fund balance. It gets a lot harder, obviously, in fiscal 21. Under this scenario, we applied the entirety of the rainy day fund balance to the problem. And then really there's the two big TBDs, maybe the biggest unknown being whether Congress is going to authorize additional aid. Right. The House of Representatives bill would provide us with over 2 years to roughly $10 billion of additional assistance, which would put us in a much stronger position. Mm-hmm. But it's pretty clear the US Senate is not as enthusiastic about that. So we really need to see what happens there. But whatever aid we don't get from the federal government, we're going to have to make up most likely with a combination of budget reductions and transfers from various fund balances. And you'll hear from the administration after me, and maybe they'll talk about some of their thoughts on that. I think the biggest challenge in terms of 21 is normally what you'd want to do is go to the Board of Public Works in June and make substantial cuts to the fiscal 21 budget because one, you get the full year of savings by doing that rather than waiting until later. And two, for the providers who maybe are going to get paid less, for the state employees who might get paid less, for anyone who's going to be impacted by those cuts, you're giving them more time to plan. The difficulty with that is, to the extent that Congress is slow to act, how much do you cut now, not knowing if you might get some money from Congress? So I think that's a real tough decision. I would imagine the administration is going to make some cuts in June, but they may not make as many as might be necessary if there's some hope that Congress will provide some assistance. And then fiscal 22 is sort of the same scenario in terms of how much federal aid do we get to help close the gap, and how much do we have to solve through budget reductions, state revenues, other state actions. So it's at a very high level, kind of the way we see the budget after accounting for the revenue estimates. Happy to answer any questions that the committee has.
Yeah, but I would say to the committee, if you want to ask a question, and I'm assuming there are many, you go down to the participants at the bottom of your screen and click on the little blue hand, and we will recognize you in the order that we see the questions come up. And we have actually a few questions already. I'll start with those that I see. Delegate Keith Haynes.
Okay. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Dave, quick question for you as relates to the rainy day fund balance. And I know you've probably gotten this question. We've said it probably 3 times over. If we tap into the rainy day fund balance as outlined in the FY21, what would be the balance after tapping into if we had to? And is there any type of insight on how, if at all, it would impact the AAA bond rating?
So the scenario we showed there would take all of the money out of the rainy day fund balance in fiscal 21. The state law does require repayment, but it would take many years to build it back up to 5% unless, and given the budget challenge you see for 22, it would certainly be hard to make a substantial deposit in fiscal 22. It certainly will not help us with our bond rating. But I mean, I think given the magnitude of the budget problem, it may help us, take a little more time to plan for how to address the long-term challenge, which, as you saw earlier, was $3 to $4 billion a year going forward. So it's not ideal, but I think we've really never seen quite such a magnitude of budget shortfall so quickly as this. So it may well be warranted to use that money to help try to get us through this. Now, if Congress comes through with a couple of $1 billion, then I would say try to hang on to at least some of that rainy day fund money, because this, we don't know how long and how deep this recession will be. But I think it may be necessary to avoid really, really deep cuts in fiscal 21.
And one follow-up question, if I may, Madam Chair, just as it relates to public safety and being able to use some of the federal dollars to supplant, or I should say, use instead of state funds, federal funds on the public safety side of things. You may not know the number now, but could you provide it to us how much savings we would have as far as state dollars if we were able to use the federal funding?
Sure. I mean, the Budget and Tax had a hearing this morning, and DBM testified that they thought at least $50 million in fiscal 20, and that's just from 3 months of activity. So if we continue that into fiscal 21, I would think, we could get at least another 100 million. Part of the challenge is the federal guidance is a little wishy-washy. So there's sort of that question about how aggressive to be without potentially running afoul of federal auditors a year or two from now.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dave.
You got your mute on.
I need to.
Delegate Kettleman, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could you explain to me the COVID-19 revenue impact, what midpoint of BRE range, and does it mean that the revenue that will be coming in to the state is going to decrease that much each year? Or what exactly does that mean?
So what the Board of Revenue Estimates did is it came up with a range of how much the revenues would be less than they forecast during session. So they had their range for fiscal 20, for example, was 876 million was kind of the better case scenario. 1,075 million was the higher end revenue loss. So it's not that revenues are going to be $1 billion less than they were in fiscal 19. It's that they're going to be $1 billion less than what we were expecting for fiscal 20, and then 2.3 billion less than we were expecting in fiscal 21.
So that sort of indicates a sense that the economy and the state is going to come back more slowly. And if it comes back more quickly, then those numbers might be better.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. As I said, I think one of the key things is Moody's, whose economic forecast was sort of the basis for these numbers, is assuming that that there's no vaccine available until the end of next summer. So that in particular would, I think, change the forecast quite a bit if it were to be, available. Some people have talked about January, February. If it is available that soon, we might see a faster rebound. And I mean, frankly, everyone's forecasting right now is really a best guess in reality. I mean, Moody's has changed their forecast a couple of times in the last month, and they get worse and worse each time they come out, because already I think unemployment has kind of blown away a lot of people's expectations and been much worse than expected. So it's very unpredictable, but it may be that the recovery comes back faster than people are forecasting as well. So
Thank you.
I think this is a sort of best number for planning right now, but I mean, there's a lot of chance that it's going to be wrong by a substantial amount, either up or down.
Thank you very much.
Delegate Valentino Smith.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Romans, just following up with Delegate Kettleman, is that big drop in revenue impact more attributable to a loss in sales or a loss in income tax, or what's the biggest hit, the biggest financial hit that you have built into that number?
It's pretty evenly divided between primarily withholding on the income tax and on the sales tax. It's roughly an even split. I can forward to the committee the BRE had some slides that actually illustrate that very nicely.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Romans?
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah. David, the unemployment number now, or the unemployment dollars and stuff, we're getting substantial assistance, maybe all of it from the federal government at this point. As this thing, if this prolongs and gets, as longer it goes, the worse that situation is going to be. If the federal government says relax and open up and we continue to stay closed, is there any danger that they're going to say, well, we're not going to cover those extra costs?
And I think that there would have to be some sort of congressional action to do that. I mean, we certainly know some of the enhanced unemployment benefits, I believe, expire come July. And there's been some discussion in Washington that they don't want to extend those enhanced benefits. So we may see an end to the enhanced benefits, but I think anything else would require a change in the law to penalize states that were slower to reopen.
Okay. And then, Madam Chair, if I could just follow up.
Sure.
Do you know if the numbers are still increasing, it appears, and is the system to the point where the people are getting, the problems we had with people getting unemployment has obviously been really troublesome. Have you been on top of that or seeing that, or do you have any opinion as far as, is that system working much better now?
I don't really have any more insight than what's been reported in the media and what the governor's office has said. I mean, it sounds like they've made improvements, but I can't speak to whether it's working as smoothly as the customers would like.
I think one of the things that we experienced actually just this week in our district office was, at the end of the day, we do callbacks to people that we've helped try to get through the unemployment system. And our staff, Jeannie Ferretti, reported to me yesterday for the first time when she did her callbacks. Our constituents were saying, yes, they made a connection. Yes, they reached out to me. Yes, I'm in the process now. So just anecdotally, in my district office, I will tell you that I do believe that the improvements made started taking some effect this week. And I think, you just need to check in with other offices. I don't know how other people have been experiencing this, but it's 90% of our calls in the last 2.5 months have been about unemployment insurance and the terrible situation that existed within the Division of Labor trying to process these. So, but I do hope that there have been some improvements, and I do hope that what my office is experiencing is felt across the state. Is there anyone that else that has a question? Are you finished with your questions for Mr. Romans? Okay. Dave, as always, thank you for your presentation. We'll be back in touch, I'm sure, in the weeks ahead as we monitor what's going on with revenues coming in, and of course, any adjustments that are needed in the state budget. So thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have Secretary Brinkley?
I am. Pardon me,
Very good.
Madam Chair. I'm
Yes.
here. And I bring greetings to everybody and to the Madam Speaker. It's good to see you too. And Madam Chair, I appreciate your patience and indulgence as we tried to schedule this
Yes.
meeting.
Yes.
For the rest of the members, we had conversations about having this earlier, but I think we both agreed that until we had Board of Revenue estimates come to whatever report they were going to put forward, and then BPW actions, there really wasn't a whole lot to have a conversation about. But for the record, those of you who don't know, I'm David Brinkley, the Secretary of the Department of Budget and Management, and I have with me Deputy Secretary Mark Nicole, who can be called upon if we get down very deep in the weeds. I will point out now, I said this earlier in the Senate conversation that we had, that Mark recently ascended to, what are you, chair, or are you executive director, or whatever it is, the National Association of State Budget Officers? What's your title?
President.
Okay, he's president of it.
Yeah.
Through resignation of the other president, he came up through the chair. So that is a phenomenal opportunity for Maryland, because Mark is involved in some of the calls with the White House and the National Governors Association. And so we typically, I'll get a text message at 10 or 11 o'clock at night with the latest news. And I will also point out, it's not a part of my comments here, but for the benefit of you, Madam Chair, and the Speaker, and the members of the committee, that we have regular conversations with DLS staff, and I know Mark and David Romans go back and forth, and I was only able to catch the last part of Mr. Romans' presentation to you. I did see it in its entirety earlier with the Senate, and so I think we're trying to break down any barriers that exist so that there's information going back and forth, and I appreciate him and that staff for that, because we are all in unprecedented territory with this and how we're going to manage it moving forward. So I appreciate that. And I touched on why I thought that this week would be just a little bit better for us to have that conversation. Any talk earlier regarding some of this substance just would have been premature, as we're still trying to find some things out. So in an unusual check-in meeting last week, as you heard, Board of Revenue Estimates had a meeting and a conversation trying to evaluate what's the range of the impact for not just this year, but next year. And we're also looking at 22, because we will shortly be sending directions to the agencies on their requests for FY22. I know that when I was in the legislature, we never saw the budget until the governor released it in January, yet I learned as secretary that those directions go out to the agencies typically in July. And we start scheduling and analyzing and having those conversations toward the end of September and October, as we're then making recommendations to the governor. And so all those conversations are certainly relevant. For those of you who don't know, the range of the impact on the current fiscal year for the next 6 weeks is about $9.25 million to $1.1 billion. On top of that, we have costlier revenue losses in the out years of 21 and 22. We certainly hope that this is once in a lifetime experience that we're dealing with, but the BRE updates indicate the magnitude and the timing of the stabilization actions that have to be taken. These new projections will punch a 6% hole in the current fiscal year. And keep in mind that impact is only from a 3-month window. The problem worsens to more than 13% when we extrapolate that out to the full year in FY21, before potentially reaching 20% in FY22. To put that in perspective, if we were to hit that threshold, and granted that's a very dire threshold, that would be equivalent to having the same general fund revenue that we had in the 2016 budget. And if we're in that year, going back 6 fiscal years. So that's one of our challenges. We all acknowledge the governor for his swift and decisive response to the revenue downturn by ordering a budget freeze on non-coronavirus related spending. He also instituted a hiring freeze to keep personnel related costs in check. Now, I will point out that we do have certain exceptions in there, because we are all cognizant of the challenge that we have with correctional officers. So we are continuing that conversation to recruit people and train people, because we have a long way to go to play catch up on that. And we recognize there are certain areas where we have to keep moving forward on that. And the governor vetoed several new and increased mandates passed during the shortened and rushed legislative session that you all recently concluded. Yesterday's BPW reductions represented a minor but a necessary step in our plan to protect the state's finances. The administration's general strategy is to harness any general funds that had been set aside for PAYGO that has not been spent or allocated or spoken for with a specific project, or that are not needed at this time. And so as such, no projects were canceled, and the unallocated funding will help cover the FY20 shortfall. Our grand total recognizes more than $120 million in general fund agency reductions, including, and you heard Mr. Romans reference this, 2 reductions from the dedicated purpose account amounting to $97 million. I know that he talked on the $35 million for WMATA. I don't recall that he discussed what the other 2 projects were. They were wrapped into one because they were to the university system. The one is the Southern Maryland project that we have going down there with the university system. That project is on schedule and is on track. And we had conversations with the university system last year that we want to keep that moving forward. And we will, if we have to, dip in to make that balance funding in the 22 budget that's submitted, the capital budget that's submitted. The other project is UMES for the pharmacy school they have over there. We just have a cash flow issue with that. Why? Because they don't have the contractors lined up. There's been a delay in that. So that's something we can also accommodate. But both of those projects are still a very important goal of this administration. And we have commitments to work with the university system. And I'll, maybe I shouldn't go here, but I will anyway. When Mark had the conversations with the university system, if we have something so cataclysmic this fall that we really have to take a whole nother look at this, they've agreed that they can dip into some of their cash just to keep them moving and come to fruition. And if we don't make it up in 22, we can make it up in 23 or through some other allocation. But I think it's important for the members to know that those projects are very important. And just from a cash flow point of view, we can use that money for the short term. There's a $7 million reduction in the Maryland Department of Planning through the Heritage Structure Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program. Madam Chair, you'll know that when I was in the Senate, I was very strongly in favor of this type of program. Has been modified a little bit since then. And the Secretary, I think, did a great job when we reached out to them to say, what do you have in the pipeline? Because there's a 3-year spend down on this. And this money is in excess of what they have commitments for in the next 3 years. And so from a cash flow point of view, we're okay with that. And ironically, July 1, another $9 million in the other budget goes right back into this program. So we're not jeopardizing any particular products by harvesting this. And then $6.7 million in the Department of Education's capital grant program. That's all about school safety and those type of programs. It's all the submitted programs have been accommodated, and there still is budget in the 21 money in the budget in the 21 budget coming forward that can help out with this, and they just don't have the the money allocated at this point in time. So again, for the short term, we can utilize that and get us across the finish line. Excuse me. These were the easiest actions to stomach. Future actions are going to be a lot more challenging, and they're going to require an awful lot of courage on everybody's part. So in spite of the progress that we've made, we still have a long way to go. And honestly, the path is not clear. Nobody has written a book for how do you deal with something of this type, and particularly with the impact and as quick as it's happened. So we're going to remain proactive when we can and reactive when we have to be. To certainly ensure public safety and everything else that we need to do. We're committed to doing what's necessary to provide essential government services and get our citizens and state on a glide path to recovery. Again, we don't know how long that's going to take or exactly the magnitude of what it's going to look like. And you keep in mind that the numbers that you saw that David Roman shared with you, but based on the Board of Revenue estimates, they are premised on a couple of things happening. One of those being that we have an active and very diverse, program where we're doing shots for everybody, just like the flu vaccine. And we'll have to have a vaccination process by, I think it's next fall, was his underlying premise. Keep in mind the state's ability to weather the storm is entirely dependent on our willingness to make some difficult decisions and make some sacrifices where we can and when we can. No, I've tried to advise all of the agencies. No one person, no one agency, no one department will be exempt from this. It certainly is about reprioritizing our resources to ensure that we have the biggest bang for not just our dollar, but also to ensure the safety of the citizenry. And I got to tell you, with some of the numbers that we heard, I was on a call with the county executive earlier, and Fran Phillips spoke of the numbers, that while we are seeing a lot of positive cases now coming in. Why? Because we're able to do much more testing. We still have a lot more testing to do, but the critical numbers are the hospitalizations, the intensive care accommodations. They have flattened and are starting to decrease. I would fully expect to see some of that increase now that we're starting to see some opening up. But the governor's actions quickly did seem to flatten the curve, gave us time. It gave us time to build up some accommodations with the convention center downtown as an acute care facility. What's going on out in Jessup and in Hagerstown with the prison hospitals that they're doing there, 2 50-bed facilities there to accommodate facilities, and also with what we've done in Prince George's County by reopening some of those beds and accommodations there. That's the challenge that we've been faced with in the short term, and we still have to stay on top of it and move forward. So that's all I have for you, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair. And I know that Mark, you're on. I don't know if I missed something. I had my phone dinged a few times, so maybe that was him touching on some things that I hadn't touched on. We're trying to be as proactive as you guys are. So, Mark, is there anything you want to add?
Not at this time, Secretary. I think you hit the high points.
Let me ask a question, if I might, and you may be able to answer it and maybe not. But when we have gone through, as a few of us on this call have gone through, this would be our third recession that we have gone through on the Appropriations Committee. I'm seeing the speaker, of course, shake her head. She knows exactly what I speak. Matter of fact, I came in as a brand new delegate appointed by Schaefer, and my first vote was to make massive cuts to the state budget in a special session in 1992. But let me ask a question. There's two things I want to kind of, if I can, flesh out with you to see if you can give us some insight. One, typically, when we have gone through recessions, we have learned the hard lessons from the early 90s when we had that recession, in which we actually tried to cut the capital budget along with the operating budget and caused a double dip, if you will, in our recession. We caused ourselves to have a second wave, second recession, because we cut capital budget severely, therefore laying off and eliminating a number of jobs. What's the discussion been around cuts in the operating versus capital budget?
Let me try to unmute my device there. And I heard an echo in the back, so someone else might have an open microphone. So, but as I heard your question, it was about what are the criteria on the decisions on capital side versus operating side. Right now, we have a operating crisis in trying to move forward on what's going on. The construction industry seems to be moving forward, and there hasn't been a lot of interruption there, other than what I heard from transportation, that Pennsylvania, when it shut down, had put some of its shops out of business, not out of business, but they had stopped them and suppressed them. They had issues getting supplies of steel, and they had an issue with some contractors based in Pennsylvania not being able to show up to the job site. Right now, that's not of an acute concern, to the point that it actually might benefit the state in some regards, in that we're now seeing some bids coming in for some of the ongoing projects coming down. Last year, the decision the Secretary of Budget Management gets to make is a projected inflation cost factor as we're trying to figure out the 5-year capital budget. And last year, I did a one-time bump up of 9% just to try to compress something that was workable going forward. We had been seeing 4%, 4.5%, and even 5% increases. Why? We didn't have as many contractors, and they all said, we got plenty of work. We don't need you. This is our price, take it or leave it. We're starting to see that kind of come back, and we acknowledge that the capital budget is an opportunity to keep a lot of people in work and at work. That's not necessarily, as I see in the short term, our constraint. Our constraint might be if real estate valuations dip and we start hitting those corridor thresholds. Delegate Haynes asked about if we were to deplete the rainy day fund all the way, would the bond rating agencies have a concern with that? They don't have so much a concern, at least historically, with states dipping into the rainy day fund. Virginia does it all the time. They have a big problem if you don't reinstate it. And so that's where our obligation is that we have to maintain a statutory 5% minimum. We still have those buffers. And to the extent that our assessments or our funding capability, which is with the annuity bond fund, has the capability to backfill those obligations, they're not going to lose a lot of sleep over it. Now, it could also be that we see some projects deferred. That helps the state. It's a cash flow deferral, which is exactly the issue I was talking about on UMES, where they're just trying to find contractors willing to come down below Salisbury to do some of that type of work. And so it's a great question, but right now our focus is on the operating side. We feel that we have the capacity to deal with the capital side. And if anything, we might even have an opportunity to stretch some of those projects. We might have imputed a cost of X and they might come in lower at Y.
Well, and I don't want to get into this in this meeting, but that's one of the reasons personally I was concerned about having the actions taken that affected House Bill 1, which was the school construction bill, but we will deal with those later. I just think it's important, those of us who were around in the early 90s and remember so well what we did to ourselves when we tried to or thought that we should cut and slash the capital budget in the same way that we needed to do the operating budget. The final question I have, and then we do have members that have some questions for you, Mr. Secretary, is, when when we find ourselves in situations such as these, a budget crisis, budget, dilemmas, one of the things that leads us out of these situations and back to good fiscal health again is a prioritization, if you will. I mean, to really understand where the legislature and the administration and all of us need to focus our time and effort, and to understand what our priorities are in state funding. And so has that been articulated at all within the administration, just saying, here are the areas that are a priority to this administration. They are blank, blank, and blank. I mean, what are the three top areas that you believe that the administration and you will focus on trying to protect?
Well, I think, Madam Chair, right now it's obvious to all of us. Why? Because there's been very little dissent. The time when you hear back and forth sometimes with people is when they disagree on things. We are all united in trying to ensure that we have the capacity in our healthcare environment and that we get the supplies that are needed. And I know that could be a conversation point that we have here because we have serious supply chain issues. And it's not just Maryland, it's the whole government. All the governments throughout this country and now the world have supply chain issues. So we're all united in trying to ensure what it is that we have to do to ensure the public safety and buy time. It's buying time for the medical profession, not just to treat people that get sick, but also for the research side so they can develop a vaccine or develop other strategies so that we can get to some sense of normalcy of what we all know. And, as we're trying to dip our toe back into the water to try to get people back to work, try to get some of these jobs back up and running. And it's never going to look the same. I don't know that anybody necessarily has a crystal ball on what it's going to look like, but that's what we're trying to focus on. And we're trying to do a juggling act, try to figure it all out. Again, I haven't heard it expressed elsewhere, but I understand from our Secretary of Corrections that Maryland had been one of the ones that was on the forefront in trying to ensure safety for those in those type of arrangements, correctional facilities, the state mental hospitals, and the DJS facilities, the congregate care facilities. You see where we had to be reactive in the nursing home environments, something that we might regulate, but aren't necessarily our facilities, yet we stepped in to do something like that. So, there might be a lot of things that are still priorities out there, but we still might have to make some reductions and try to make sure that we get resources to other areas that might be emerging up. And honestly, in our short window that we've had here, these 2 months in dealing with it, that's the wave that has come. I think that the governor and the legislature has been very effective in trying to communicate that to get people to stay safe. There might be some disagreements on how that's happened. And you saw where the federal lawsuit was thrown out yesterday, which was ridiculous in what we're trying to move forward with. But as we go forward, here's the big unknowns, and we're in the same pool too. How long is it going to last, and how severe is it going to be? Every expert you talk to has given you a different answer depending on the week that we ask them. And yet we don't have that luxury of being able to say, oops, let's change our mind. We only have so many resources at our disposal, and we're trying to be reactive in moving that forward. Right now it's healthcare. My dog is not happy that he's stuck outside. Louis, hush. I'll bring him in a second.
Look, I certainly wouldn't debate you on the importance of healthcare. There is one group of people that I think the speaker in particular has pointed to, that every one of them have been disrupted and had their lives disrupted, and we don't know how long they're going to stay disrupted, and that's the school kids in Maryland. So I would say that the one word I was waiting to hear in conjunction with health and public safety is we do need, it's my opinion. I know that I echo the strong opinion of Speaker of the House and President of the Senate in saying that in the budget considerations moving forward, every school child in Maryland had their lives disrupted. And we've got to at least figure out a path forward for them as well. I'm gonna, by the way, Mr. Secretary, I'm gonna, if you don't mind, we have some questions that I'd like to get to.
I'm gonna step out real quick and let my dog in now. I thought I left the door open a bit so he could get in. I'll be right back in about 10 seconds.
Delegate Kettleman's got a cat. I don't know if we want him on the same screen.
I haven't got my camera yet.
Okay, all right.
I'm back.
Delegate
I gotta say,
Resnick.
this is a totally new dimension when we're, trying to let pets back in and still try. And I noticed that her avatar is a picture of her cat up. I don't know if it's an avatar or whatever, but Delegate
Yeah.
No, that's actually my cat. That's Boo.
Oh, very good. All right, Delegate Resnick. You need to unmute him.
Never have happened. Oh.
There he is.
This dog situation would have never have happened in Annapolis. But I have two questions I'd like to ask the secretary. The first one has to do with IT systems. One of the concerns I had during the session and even before was the administration's undertaking of a number of IT systems and management systems that have been in flux. By way of example, MD Think, which obviously I've been directly involved with, is a year late. It's about 120% over budget and has had numerous problems being rolled out. The rollout of the mental health Medicaid payment system with the new contractor Optum experienced significant issues. We had months of professionals not being paid for their services. There's a lot of concerns over the LTSS system and the rollout from the developmental disabilities community. With all of those in mind, and then also there are other systems. There's the MMIS system that's being rolled out, the continuation of electronic health records. With regard to the cuts that the Board of Public Works has made, and with what you and the administration are projecting into the future, what effect do you think the future cuts that we're anticipating is going to have on any and all of these new systems that the administration has undertaken?
Good question. I don't think I have a direct answer on each and every one of them. I know that Maryland Think was something that I was involved in some of the calls on, and I still have some staff people involved in it, which is also its own experiment. Since 90% of its initial funding was from the federal government, hoping to be able to expand some of that. Mark, I'm about to call on you to see if you have any background on some of this, or keys that you want to fill in on, because I know that we've had a lot of things shifted with where we have to go on this. I will point out one thing that is already in place, which had been done previously, which is proving very beneficial to this state, and I think the only state. And that is, well, because we had a lot of issues with it with correctional officers before, but that's Workday. And Workday was able to be developed to have a little pull down so we can track anybody in a COVID-19 aspect for reimbursement purposes from the federal government. And a lot of other states have said you have that type of capability. But Mark, do you want to touch base on some of these other, I wrote down the mental health issue, the LTSS, and then MMIS. Are you aware of any changes on those?
Mr. Secretary and Mark, my question in general has to do with sort of the anticipation of cuts to all of these various IT systems as a whole, not necessarily the status of any of them.
Sure.
Well, and well, let me chime in again, Mark, just on that aspect, because he's if your aspect is what we're going to do going forward on it, I think each and every one of them would have to have a consideration of where we stand on it. But we got to move forward on all of them. The question is, are we able to move forward as fast as we had been on all of them? It might be that we have to rededicate some resources to something to bring it to fruition, and then deal with some of the other ones and just a prioritization that way. But Mark?
Exactly, Secretary. I think I would echo your comments. I think we would treat this a lot like we treat the capital budget. If you have a major IT project that's in implementation, obviously it needs to move forward. Maybe you'll have to move forward a little bit more slowly. And where we look to make savings is maybe not starting some new projects, and those get put on hold for a year or two.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. My second question deals with Blue Flame Medical, which you may have heard of. I sent a letter to our chief procurement officer at this point about almost 3 weeks ago. I haven't gotten a response. Blue Flame Medical, for anybody who doesn't know, is a company that was started in late March by two political consultants who had no experience at all in medical supply chain. But they started the company and sold, or purported to sell, Maryland $12.5 million worth of PPEs and ventilators, which were never delivered upon. The state has since attempted to cancel the contract. My understanding is today they have delivered 27 of the 100 and something ventilators they promised, and are demanding the contract be reinstated. My letter to the chief procurement officer had to do with how a company like this, understanding that we're in emergency times and we need to move fast, but how a company with no experience, no corporate capability in this area, no history whatsoever of being able to source these materials, how they got a $12.5 million contract from the state to be able to do this, and got 50% upfront in payment. Do we not have checks and controls on these kinds of procurements?
It's a great question, and it's one reason why I think that we went after them. The state of Maryland went after them. It's also another reason potentially why, if it's the same organization that you're referencing, California was on the hook for $500 million with that same firm. But my recollection in the news reports is that we were the first ones to blow the whistle, and then California came in behind us. So it's a great question, and I'm anxious to hear what the chief procurement officer feeds back to you too. I do think it goes to the point that while we might be in a position to try to line up a lot of contracts to gain access to whatever materials or PPE or whatever you want to call it, that we might have been signing an awful lot of contracts with the exception of maybe the half that was sent as a down payment on this thing. Most of them have been, we're not paying any money out until we get fulfillment of the contract or substantial type of fulfillment. But as you get a response from the chief procurement officer, I'd love to see what you get, and I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Well, I appreciate that. The administration has not really sought fit to respond to any of my letters. So to the extent that you can goose the chief procurement officer on my behalf, that would be fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Stay safe down there.
Delegate Jackson. Go ahead.
I don't hear anything.
I don't either. Delegate Jackson, we can't hear you. Are you on mute on your computer? Why don't I go to Delegate Solomon and I'll come back to you in a minute. Delegate Solomon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I had two questions for you. The first one's pretty quick. Just curious when you have a sense of what the state will have spent in terms of all the federal money that we got through the CARES Act, if there'll be a full accounting of it. I know some of it is contingent on federal guidance coming through, but if you have an update on when we'll get a full accounting of where all that federal money is going. And then the second question is, obviously the tolls that we're looking at on a lot of our roads are going to be impacted. It seems like most companies that can continue to do telework for, the foreseeable future, potentially for over the next year, are going to do that. So just curious what your sense is and what the discussions have been within the administration on toll projects and what the projections around telecommuting is going to mean for large infrastructure projects that may be reliant on tolls for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have conversations with the secretary periodically. A lot of our recent conversations have been about reopening the state in certain capacities and what models to use. And they have a very good model from a retail point of view with MVA and all that. We haven't gotten into the toll structure, or I haven't, maybe Mark has and some of his team and the analysts that track transportation, but we all know that there's going to be a significant hit there. Everywhere, because we're seeing a decrease in registration fees, we're seeing a decrease in fuel taxes, we're seeing a decrease in the sales tax. All of that's going to happen. At the same time, we're having a decrease in utilization of some of the highways. In fact, state police had to step up some of their enforcement because there's so little traffic out there, and some people are driving at breakneck speed. So let me go to the first part. First part is on accounting for all this money that's coming in, and by DLS's account, potentially upwards of $6 billion that might be coming in from the federal government. We are getting updated information in how and where and when we can use certain monies. Almost every 24, 48 hours, we get something new. I'll turn it over to Mark too, because he can give an example on one of them. For example, we're now, when David Romans referenced that effective March 1 to the end of the calendar year, being able to utilize some of the money for healthcare workers that the locals are incurring, and also for law enforcement, and the discussion as to whether we can use some of that in corrections and all that. That came just at the beginning of this week. And so we're getting, the portion where we can, we have to provide a matching grant for some disaster funds. We learned also about 48 hours ago that we could use the COVID or the CARES Act money to satisfy the state match on some of that aspect. And so some of the definitions and all are changing as we speak. There had been conversations about, because the governor had discretion on, for those of you who don't know, the top 5 in population jurisdictions were able to tap into the Treasury directly for some CARES Act funding. That left 19 others. We then went to the governor and he said, yes, I do want to have that utilized with the locals. We made the decision to get things out on the street as quick as possible, that the first half shall be allocated to those locals through the health department. What we wanted were the local health departments to sign off, and that they got priorities if they needed respirators or PPE or anything of that sort, just depending, as long as the health office in that county could sign off on it. Now we got some pushback and back and forth, and then we were going to figure out what to do with the second half of it. So the second half, and this does relate to your question, believe it or not, the second half, there became a lot of pressure to just give us the money, give us the money. So we held off on giving them the money until they all signed a reimbursable document that said, when this is all audited, and if we find that you spent this money outside of the parameters that the Treasury had determined, then we shall have some type of repercussion. I bring that up for this purpose. Not all states shared that money with the local governments. New York State didn't share any of it with the local governments. North Carolina shared 25% of it with the local governments. This governor and many other governors decided to share all of that portion with the locals. And then we got into a back and forth with how do we account for it. All we wanted was to get the resources into people's accounts. And when the audits come down the pike, whether it's next year or 2 years from now or whatever, and if they went outside the parameters, to have some type of feedback to it. So that was a long roundabout way to get to, we're trying to stay on top of all this. And I don't know that I mentioned it to this group. I did to the Senate group that we created a little work group of John Martin, my main analyst, Mark, who's the main budget person over at MDH, and the main procurement individual, Jordan Butler, so that they could make decisions on the fly as they're moving forward on some of this. Maybe it's not as acute now, but it had been early on in the session, and we're also trying to stay on top of where they've accounted for that money. Mark, you want to add to some of that?
Sure. So Delegate, I think in the upcoming weeks or so, you should begin seeing some budget amendments as the agencies start allocating the funds for specific types of work. One of the amendments that we're getting ready to process in the not too near future would take the money that the governor had originally allocated from the rainy day fund for the business grants and loans and move that over to the coronavirus relief fund. We believe that's an eligible expense. So that's $137 million that we will be able to put back into the rainy day fund to, address the budget shortfalls. It is certainly an allowable use. And so that amendment ought to be coming in the near future, as well as a number of other amendments to pay for the costs of PPE. As David Roman said, we are going to use some funds for covering the costs of salaries in state police. We believe we can use some of this money to cover a portion of our local health grant costs. So we're going to use the federal funds in that area and save some general funds. So you should be seeing these in the not too distant future.
Thank you. And I would just echo the sentiments of the chairwoman about education. I know the District of Columbia made a commitment earlier this week to continue to increase their education funding for the coming year by 3%. And it seems like there's a lot of flexibility for that funding to go to education systems. And I think we could make a pretty strong argument that COVID has had a pretty long-lasting impact on our kids, and we could probably backfill a lot of the potential education shortfall with some of that funding. So I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The speaker, Adrian Jones, has a question for you.
Yes. Back on May 8th, Chairman McIntosh and Chairman Pendergrass and myself sent a letter about the state personnel and protections, their PPE, and I was wondering, did you get that, and where are you on that?
I had seen it, and I'd read it before this meeting because the question was brought up in the last meeting that I had about it. And I don't know where the response is on it, honestly, but I do know this. I do know that our focus has been on supply chains to make sure we get the equipment and to make sure that it gets distributed to those that need it the most. And certainly I know that the Secretary of Corrections has been very adamant on some of the work that he's going through. I saw even that there was a demand that we use some of the testing equipment in to test every state employee. The comptroller mentioned that he'd love to be able to get his people tested, all of his employees tested at yesterday's BPW meeting. And maybe there'll come a time when we can do that. But right now, because we still have a limited supply of all that, though it's rapidly going up, and the governor announced that they're now doing, I guess, testing either starting today or tomorrow without a doctor's referral, because we're now increasing that type of capacity. But I also saw early on, and this is something where I learned from some of my local doctors up here, that everybody wanted an N95 mask that they could, get a continual supply of them. I then learned from surgeons and doctors up here in Frederick that, especially from the radiologist, he said, you don't want an N95 mask to come and go and come and go. Each one has to be fitted to people. I didn't know that. So there is a level, and I think one of the questions that you had was that Battelle system up and operating? Because that is to take care of sanitizing as opposed to sterilizing. I learned that there's a distinction there too. And my understanding is that went operational a week or 10 days ago. I don't know where it is, whether it's in the 95 corridor so that there can be some accessibility to it there. But that's been our big issue. And I think we still have an impediment in getting proper gowns in front of people. But I can follow up with MDH to see where any type of response might be on that. But right now we're just trying to crank some of that out. So I'll follow up with you.
Please, contact tracing, yes, also.
Oh, the contact tracing, there was an announcement made, there was an announcement made today that the governor's office just rolled this out just about an hour ago, a launch of robust contact tracing operation to support local health departments. They're going to have more than 1,400 contact tracers statewide, aiding local officials. And again, part of the thing that this is going to require is an informational thing. When you get a call from the contact tracer, it's going to show on the caller ID MD space COVID. So that might be just the caller ID is going to show that so that people are actually able to respond to it. So if you don't have that announcement, I'll make sure that you get copies of it.
Yeah, but that announcement wasn't about the state employees. That was about the state hospital.
No, it wasn't about state employees. It's about something that's greater in the context of trying to get ahead of contact tracing for not just state employees, but everybody.
All right. Looking to hear the response.
All right.
Good.
Yeah. Delegate Hinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, the BPW cuts that were made to strategic demo, the 800,000 and then the 4.2 that were made to Bernie, at a time where we are asking people to stay at home for the sake of everyone's health, can you help me understand what's behind the cuts to our housing programs that help us maintain the quality of the housing of the most vulnerable people in the state of Maryland?
Well, what's behind those, or with consultation with the agencies involved, those monies had not been allocated and don't have a project behind them for the balance of this year. Now, there will then be another flood of money into those programs that starts in 6 weeks. If you may not recall, since you weren't appointed to your seat yet, but when we started Bernie several years ago, there was a lag, and I know that the chairman knows this, there was a lag, I think, from 12 to 18 months before we really started to get that program up and going. They had to find people to do the work, they had to identify the projects to do the work, and funding for those programs has significantly increased over time. Where we are now is, this is what they've identified to us is money that will be unspent and would potentially roll over into the next year. We know that there are some monies there, and we are not interfering with any of the projects, the contracts, or anything else that's been spoken for through this part of the year.
Thank you. If I just could put a follow-up comment, the demand for those programs has far outpaced the appropriation for those programs year over year. So in future areas of looking for where we could, make cuts as a state, knowing that if we know coronavirus is likely to resurface at some point, that asking people to stay at home for all of us to be safe, for some people, that's a far greater challenge when the indoor air quality in your home is as much of a threat as some of the other things that people face in the environment, have contact with each other. If I might ask a follow-up or another question. The state's dashboard indicates that, may I, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
The state's dashboard indicates that the demographic that has been impacted the highest in terms of deaths and in terms of infections has been the Black population in the state of Maryland. What can you help me understand what the administration has done? And it's twofold in terms of the allocation of the coronavirus relief money that they've gotten on a federal level, and then the rainy day funding. And then when it looks at the cuts as well, what has the administration done to make sure that you're not double impacting a population that has already been significantly impacted by way of the health consequences of the
Okay. Keep in mind that a lot of the larger jurisdictions had a direct tap to Treasury for a lot of the monies that they had, because we had that conversation just a little while ago. But what the governor's also been trying to do is to have, especially more recently, these strike teams that can be very quickly reactive to some of the nursing homes. And I know that they've been deployed very aggressively in Prince George's and the Silver Spring area, Montgomery County. The nursing home from just a little over a half mile from my house has lost 25% of its occupants. That's the Pleasant View in Mount Airy. And right now, what they're trying to do is as they get any type of demand, or I know that I've heard on the health calls in the morning, they are particularly sensitive to retirement communities. I then had a person reach out to me that has a lot of Section 8 housing in Baltimore City. And his issue has been, look, I've got 300 units here, and they are obviously disproportionately poor, but they're not in a nursing home. They fall in that gray zone. So how can we adapt to help some of those people out, because they are particularly vulnerable and they do have elevators and areas where they have to meet to. But the governor has, in my opinion, tried to be colorblind to it in the sense of, let's get the resources where they need to be. I know that as we have conversations with people in Western Maryland, and not so much the Eastern Shore, but Southern Maryland, that's where you're hearing all this rumbling about, let's get opened up, and let's get back going. I will also point out that the specific work group on the shore dealing with the poultry industry, part of their challenges they're dealing with are people that don't speak English very well, and some of them are not here necessarily legally. So they're just trying to have access, and they're trying to break all those barriers down so that they can gain access and information to people. I don't know that I addressed your concern or your question specifically. I just know that it's something that the challenge that we're facing, it doesn't care about race. It doesn't care about our social status. It doesn't care where we are. It only cares that there's lots of us. And that's where it's been particularly prolific. And that's what we're trying to deal with, which is also why you have counties that have different timing on when they want to lift their restrictions too. Montgomery County has been particularly harmed by it. And I don't even know that we know the extent by Baltimore City, the impact down in Baltimore City. And again, that's dealing with people who are in a position to report out or gain access to care.
Thank you.
Okay.
You characterize the governor as being colorblind on this issue. The administration has, in my opinion, done a great job at putting together a dashboard that has a wealth of information and data. The benefit of that data is allowing us to tailor outreach and a response that is effective. And being effective, you can't do that if you're blind. So I appreciate your response. I thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I think he'd like to hear that from you. Send him a note.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Delegate Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, I just wanted to, the speaker beat me to my first question. So my follow-up would be, I know you had mentioned about some of the uncertainty, and I would agree with you. There's no one consensus on how to reopen or what indicators are best to start reopening, but I think there's a general consensus that in order to open up, there must be appropriate supplies of PPE, testing, and tracing if we're ever going to get back to a sense of normal. So the question would be, to what extent has the continued or increased need for PPE testing and tracing capacity been factored into your projections that you've been sharing with us?
Well, right now, I think it also goes to the question we had originally by Delegate Resnick is to, we are being flooded by people offering to sell us things. And Secretary Schultz, this is a little sidebar, but Secretary Schultz, in handling the requests from businesses for relief and assistance, much to her chagrin, found that she had received a tremendous amount of fraudulent applications, many of them screenshots, then photoshopped. And what they, I don't think, anticipated was the burden it was going to be to verify some of the requests that they had in. We go through the same thing on some people wanting to sell us PPE and any type of equipment like that. Is how do you verify it? Now the supply chains are coming back up. When I'm on the calls in the morning, we're hearing now we're expecting 2 more truckloads of PPE. Now the next conversation, and anybody, Delegate Jackson, you probably are very, very certain on this, is now you see where the Quartermaster Corps comes in place. Once you get it in, how are you going to get it out and get it to where it's needed? It's not a matter of just having things stacked up somewhere. And I hear on the calls that that's some of their issues. So again, are you getting the supplies in? Are they the appropriate supplies? Because people will sell you, almost anything. And then how do you get it to where it can be utilized? And again, this concept of the N95 masks, I learned through all this thing that they can be sanitized. And the professionals that had been using them prior to all this told me, look, I custom fit them and I want to keep them going this way. It's not just about being disposable. Delegate, I don't know that I answered your question. I tried to get in there, but we've been dealing with supply chains, and then ensuring that that the right supplies get out to where they need to be.
And I appreciate that, Mr. I want to, generally say that this, everyone on this committee knows that our budget projections are our best guess. Right. So we're not necessarily looking for complete 100% accuracy, but generally, if we're going to be doing this until there potentially is a vaccine next summer, what is a best guess in terms of a cost that it could potentially impact the state related to providing these needed services to get back to a new normal? And that's just the general sense of the question. Hopefully we're taking that into consideration when we're getting these projections and we're getting these briefs from everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, we're taking those in. And right now, some of our conversations are, what does it have to look like to get state workers back into safe facilities? I started the conversation a couple of weeks ago based on feedback from my capital budget team and based on feedback from our personnel team, because they all work at 301. And are we going to, you have elevators that go up, I think 12 or 14 floors there. Are you going to have people congregating? How do we make sure that we have the proper screening in place? That's not even dealing with supplies and materials. It is dealing with how are we going to adapt to the new normal, or even the temporary new normal, until a vaccine is widely disseminated. Controlling pedestrian traffic patterns just to get people back at work. And it's interesting once you start opening up those conversations, and that's where we're going to have to allocate some resources to. Do we end up having more retail, which is why I talked to MBA? Do you have more retail where you have to have a plexiglass shield, where you have to ensure people's safety? Do we end up just having meetings face to face with people by appointment? So yeah, it's a supply side, but it's also then how are we going to be looking at operating going forward? And it's time to have those conversations, and we're starting them.
Thank you. Delegate Jackson, can we unmute the vice chair and see if his audio is working?
How about now, Madam Chair?
It's very good. Thank you.
All right. Technical difficulties. I think it leads into the third leg of my question, where the first two had pretty much been addressed by you, Madam Chair, streamlining processes and prioritizing when we get back on track. Mr. Secretary, I'd be interested to know as we move forward, where we stand in the last quarter of this fiscal year regarding vacancies. As we look at, the operating side of things as we're heading into, well, hopefully heading to get things righted. But digital divide, all right, the achievement gap from an educational standpoint, the school systems across the state, I think, have done a terrific job ensuring that our young people have Chromebooks, laptops, whatever version they may have. However, we have too many gaps in the state of Maryland. You live in Western Maryland, I live in Southern Maryland, and there are many places in between where our young people are falling further and further behind, becoming accustomed to the distance learning, but not really having the access to the systems that are going to keep them up to speed. So if you could speak to that. And lastly, Delegate Young, about the PPEs necessary for folks being rehired. But there's a nuance that we're going to be embarking upon. How do we hire folks from a distance? I think you touched on it. And in my day job with the county, I kind of oversee that on the Homeland Security side. How are we going to, or what types of plans has personnel and your office, what types of plans do we have in place to ensure that we're getting the best folks and when the opportunity presents itself? Thank you.
Good. Let me try to touch on some of that. On the last question that you asked, it's interesting. We just had a call internally. Mark, when was that? Yesterday that we had our leadership teams with DBM on the call, and John Martin was pointing out that we're bringing on 2 new budget analysts, and this will be the first time we've tried to bring somebody online through this type of format. And so we're going to be learning firsthand, I think, in the next couple of weeks as to how that goes. Offers had been extended to them before all this happened. But for those of you who don't know, we typically hire fresh recruits right out of business school with a master's or comparable type of degree, and they have to graduate first. Well, they're all going through that graduation process, and then we bring them on here for July 1. And so we'll be probably the test case on how we're handling that aspect. From a vacancy point of view, your first question, I don't have the answer to that off the top of my head. We'll find out where we are.
Thank you.
But we're very cognizant of where we stand on, well, not necessarily the numbers, but that corrections has an ongoing issue with it. But we also know that he had been making great strides. And I think that got shadowed by all the activity surrounding this and your hustle to adjourn relatively quickly because you had to. Some of the incentive packages that the secretary had put in place had worked, and we stopped the bleed of some people that we anticipated retiring on that. So that has certainly been a very positive aspect. What was one of the other, you had another question in there that I forgot.
Digital divide. The
digital divide. And so I've gotten requests from a few parents, not too many, but a few parents that were very upset. There's 2 issues to that aspect, especially as kids are having to be at home. One is making sure they have the hardware to connect. And that's, something that even in Baltimore City, I know the chairman is very focused on that, and all school systems are trying to react to that. The other one comes in what type of access do they have, and the access that we're trying to ensure that the rural areas, but I will point out to you that while we always thought of, the access to the internet in the rural, it was strictly in the rural areas. I can point out that in Baltimore County, you have the Secretary of Appointments, Chris Cavey, and a senior person check that, a senior technology person with DGS working up along the same roadway in Baltimore County do not have internet access. The cable lines run through the street and there's no service, which I was appalled by and reached out to PSC. And of course, for cable companies, PSC has no dominion over that. It's strictly a county issue. So they're having to work wirelessly in that context. So that type of access is not just a rural issue. It certainly is in Baltimore County and the upper parts of Carroll County too. And I know that the rural community has been very active in trying to gain funding on that. Ironically, Mark, you may want to chime in on this. Ironically, I think by the time we get fully wired with gaining some of our rural access, they'll end up with low-level satellites, and everybody will have access through satellite connection. But Mark, you want to add to anything?
Just one point, Secretary. I do know that there was an item approved at the Board of Public Works yesterday to provide some additional rural broadband funding to some of the counties.
Yep.
And I do know that as in having reviewed some of the county plans for the coronavirus relief fund, that a couple of the counties had suggested that they might be using some of the money to one, either make devices available to students and or to improve broadband access.
That's the word I was looking to use with rural broadband. It just escaped me.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just add something to that. You're absolutely accurate when you talk about the rural issues around broadband and access. And I'm in the Baltimore County example, that's along one road. I think people ought to know that in our larger counties, and I can only speak to my city, 30% of the families who send their kids to Baltimore public schools do not have internet access. 30%. You know, that's like 25,000 kids don't have internet access in their home. So this is a big issue, and it's huge, and it's both an urban and a rural issue. It is not just, and I think there are pockets in suburban areas, depending on which suburban county you are, but it's a huge issue. Thank you to the Vice Chair for bringing this up.
Madam Chair?
Here's, we are near, yes.
If I might, Secretary Brinkley, I would love to speak to you offline regarding, there are some measures that have been taken in public safety and military where that access via devices is insured. And hopefully we're looking at a temporary situation. Obviously there's a budgetary component to that. I'd love to talk to you offline. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're very welcome. Listen, committee, we are nearing the end of our time here that we need to jump off. There are a couple of other questions, and I'm going to ask those members to get me those questions in writing, and I will get them to you, Mr. Secretary. But I want to thank again the speaker and all of the members who have joined today. I want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, and Mark. Congratulations for your election. But having said that, we are at a point where we need to adjourn for another time. So let me thank everybody, and I want everyone to have a good weekend. Okay.
Thank you. Yep. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.